Good morning. Today we are going to be working on the Sunday school lesson for February the 27th in the Jesus Storyteller series, but let's open up with a word of prayer. God, thank you so much for the opportunities that you have given us and the blessing of simply waking up this morning. We are thankful that each day that you give us is another day to serve you and to serve others. God, this morning we lift up in prayer anyone who is sick, who is hurting, or who just needs to remember that you are always close. God, open our hearts and our minds this morning to receive what you would have for us through these scripture passages. Amen. So we are working this morning on lesson 13 in the Jesus Storyteller Bible study. This is entitled Use It or Lose It. The focal text here is Luke 19:11 through 27. Up to this point, we have been working on the parables. This is the parable of the minas, or your Bible may say the parable of 10 pounds. The general idea that we're talking about is very similar to another familiar parable in Matthew 25, which is the parable of the talents. And we are going to be talking about some of the important similarities and differences between the two stories. The main idea for this study today is all Christians have opportunities to serve our master. Some servants do a better job of taking advantage of them, and they are rewarded for it. And then the question that we're going to explore is, what am I doing with what I have been given? And our study aim, as stated by the book, is to examine our current use of our time and talents, knowing that we will be judged on how well we maximize our opportunities to serve God. So let's talk a little bit about the historical context of this passage before we dive right into it. So we are talking about three main ideas within this passage. The first is living for Christ and serving him faithfully. The second is the necessity of working and serving Christ while we wait for him to return. And the third is the importance of preparing for judgment before God. So a lot of these parables we're seeing on Jesus's journey to Jerusalem. And this one is really up right at the end. We see Jesus here telling this parable in Zacchaeus' house. And Jesus knows that his day of death is drawing near as he moves towards Jerusalem and towards the cross and towards the next step in his journey. We also know that Passover is occurring at this time, and that Jesus is borrowing this story from another similar historical story to tell this lesson. So Jesus is borrowing from a historical account where Herod the Great has passed and his son has to travel to receive his title as king. And we see these two stories run parallel to each other as well, because not only is Jesus using this historical context, but he is placing himself in it in a way that people will understand. So let's move into the beginning of this story. So verse 11, using the translation in your book, it says, "While they were listening to this, he went on to tell them a parable, because he was near Jerusalem and the people thought the kingdom of God was going to appear at once." So having this first verse of setting and preparing the stage for this story is really important, because we know that Jesus' parables have many meanings and many layers. And so yes, the story is about a king, but it also parallels a historical story, and it also includes aspects where Jesus is placing himself in the role of the king and his followers in the role of the servants. So this is very important. It is also important to note that at this time, a lot of Jewish people were ready, because they believed that the cross was the end and Jesus was going to be ushering in his kingdom. And so this includes some very important information to adjust that perspective. And it helps us to remember that this is a very urgent time. These people believed that once Jesus died, that it was going to be time to bring the kingdom, and that time was now. It was very imminent. And so understanding that, we have a better understanding of the rest of the story as we move through it. So let's move on to verses 12 and 13. verse 12 says, he said, a man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return. So he called 10 of his servants and gave them 10 minas. Put this money to work, he said, until I come back. So this instruction is vital. We get the basis of the story, and we also see where Jesus is placing himself here and telling people that he will come back and that his death on the cross is not the end of this story. So we see a man of noble birth, perhaps a king, perhaps a wealthy family, who needs to leave and travel somewhere far away to be appointed king. And he pulls in his servants and he's giving them an instruction. He gives them money and he is telling them to look after it, essentially. And he's giving them quite a bit of money. We're talking about 3 months worth of salary here. And he tells them that he's planning to leave and he's planning to return. But upon handing them this coin, he gives them the instruction, put this to work until I return. So there's two things that I want to focus on here. The first being that Jesus is telling people that he is coming back. He's telling them, I am leaving, but I will return. And upon that return, you will be accountable for what you've done in my absence. So this is really important because, as we just discussed, the Jewish people did not believe the same things that we do. They believed that once Jesus died on the cross, the kingdom would be ushered in. And Jesus is saying this is not the end of the story. This is not immediate, like you may believe it will be. I am leaving, and then I will come back, but you must do work in the meantime. The next thing I want to focus on here is the word work. Is really similar to the English word pragmatics. It's a Greek word, and it's essentially a banking term in this sense, where Jesus is saying, put this to work, invest this, use it wisely. And it also means that the lack of this word would essentially mean that they were wasting. They were wasteful of this opportunity. So those are two really important parts of those verses. Now we move on to verse 14, which tends to stick out a little bit in the story. It doesn't exactly fit. It's not quite the dialogue, but it is incredibly important. So let's read that. Verse 14 says, but his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, we don't want this man to be our king. So why is this important that it was included? This is really an allusion to Jesus' rejection by the people. We see kind of what sticks out here as an aside. It's not the dialogue between the king and his servants, so we're pulling out of what we had just been doing. But this is incredibly important because what we're looking at is people rebelling on a leader because they did not want to see themselves under his rule. This really hints at the hatred that people had for Jesus and his followers at the time, and alludes and further reminds the listener what this story is about. We are not looking at a random king in a random story. This is, as well as a historical account, it is also an allusion to Jesus, and a reminder to people that he was not well and widely loved all the time. That is not the reality. And a lot of Paul's letters reveal that. So as we move into verses 15, 16, and 17, we have more to consider. So beginning with verse 15, it says, he was made king, however, and returned home. Then he sent for the servants to whom he had given the money in order to find out what they had gained with it. The first one came and said, Sir, I have earned you 10 more. Well done, my good servant, his master replied. Because you have been trustworthy in a very small matter, take charge of 10 cities. So there's a lot to break down just in those 3 verses. First, we see a phrase that we hear a lot in the gospel, which is the well done. We see this again in the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. We frequently discuss, wanting to hear when you get to heaven, well done, my good and faithful servant. And this is a very similar allusion to that. So the king is coming back from his journey. he pulls these people back together, essentially for a reckoning. He's saying, okay, what did you do with your opportunity? You need to now be accountable to me. So the first servant announces, hey, I did a great job. I took 1 and I made 10. And the king is pleased. He says, well done, my good servant. And he places him over 10 cities. This is a reward for faithfulness and for trustworthiness. And we see this in the parable of the talents in a slight contrast. So while well done is found in both, we see similar conclusions, but we need to note that the difference is in the parable of the talents, everyone is given a different amount, and in this one, they're given the same amount, which we will circle back to the importance there in a minute. We also see a reward that is proportional to what the servant did. He produced 10, he was given 10 cities. So the reward for being trustworthy with a small amount is that now he is trusted with a larger amount that is proportional to what he produced. This is something we'll circle back to with the next servant, but it is really important to note. Let's move into verses 18 and 19 and watch the second servant. So beginning in verse 18, the second came and said, Sir, I have earned you 5 more. His master answered, you take charge of 5 cities. Again, we are seeing this proportional reward to what the person produced, what the servant produced. I also want to note that the word being used here is paleo, which is really similar to the word that we use for bear and bear fruit when you take it back to the biblical Greek, and also the word make in make fishers of men. So we are seeing an instruction to make, to create, and to be diligent. It doesn't necessarily just mean money, and I think that's important that we note that through this parable. While the example is money, and that would have been very appropriate for the setting, because again, we're in Zacchaeus' house, speaking with the tax collector. We're not just talking about money here. God is saying, produce this. He's not saying, I need a direct return on a financial investment. God is saying, I'm trusting you with something, and you will produce more from it. So that's really important to note. And now he's over 5 cities. And so as we move into the next section, let's keep an eye on what the results are of not following through with the action. So beginning in verse 20, then another servant came and said, Sir, here is your mina. I have kept it laid away in a piece of cloth. I was afraid of you because you are a hard man. You take out what you do not put in and reap what you did not sow. So this is obviously a deviation from the previous 2 servants in terms of what they did with the money and what they had to return. So we see the servant come into the presence of the king. He presents the money back. He says, here you go. I wrapped it up. I kept it safe because I was scared of you. I was afraid of what would happen. And he accuses the king of benefiting from the work of others. So he is in direct contrast with these other servants who took their opportunity and did as they were instructed. He did not take his opportunity. He was afraid of the risk. And so he comes back and admits to not taking his opportunity, and also accuses the master of taking advantage of other people's work. As we move into 22 and 23, we're going to look at the master's response of this. So in verse 22, his master replied, I will judge you by your own words, you wicked servant. You knew, did you, that I am a hard man, taking out what I did not put in and reaping what I did not sow? Why then didn't you put my money on deposit so that when I came back, I could have collected it with interest? So we're starting to see some judgment come out of the king here. And he's condemning this servant not only for not doing what he was instructed, but also for his accusation on the king. So the king says essentially 2 things. First, that this servant was wicked and was disobedient of his instructions. But 2, that the servant's accusation was going to turn back on him, and that was not appropriate. So we see him begin to condemn this servant, but then we get an interjection here. So first, he is going to lay down an instruction, and then he will be questioned. So in 24, we see, then he said to those standing by, take his money away from him and give it to the one who has 10. And the people respond, sir, he already has 10. And so we see the people start to question, and these are the same people that were not fond of the king in the beginning, who did not want him around, who did not want him to rule over them, and they are now questioning his fairness. So the king here is rewarding the faithful servant and taking away from the servant who did not follow through with his instructions. The people are confused. They said, sir, essentially, why are you taking from someone and giving to someone who already has so much? And this, I believe, is a great show of grace, because we don't see the servant banished. The king does not say, never come to me again. You need to leave my kingdom. You need to leave anywhere that I could see you. And I think this is a fantastic allusion to Jesus' instruction here, because he is telling the servant, I did not tell you. You're not doing what I told you, but I'm not going to banish you. I'm just not going to give you this opportunity. So that's a fantastic reminder that we are not, Jesus does not push us out, away from him, out of his reach. However, if we are not responsible with the opportunities that we are given, those can go away. So we move into the king explaining his judgment to the people in verse 24 and 25. In 26. So we see the king say, he replied, I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. But as for the one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away. And so here he's explaining his choice to the people, because they questioned, why are you taking away from this man who does not have as much and giving to someone who has more? And the king takes this opportunity to let the people know. Not only am I going to reward people who do well, but the opposite will occur. I will stop offering opportunities to those who are not being responsible with these opportunities. Again, we see that hint of grace we just talked about here. This third servant is not thrown out of the kingdom, but the king instructs the people, my servants are called to serve. They are called to be good stewards of their time, of their talent, of their money, and their job is to build the kingdom and glorify the king. To refuse to do this is displeasing. So essentially he's saying, you reap what you sow, which we see as well in Matthew. God, who in this story we allude with the king, calls the servant of Christ to share and shine his light and not hide behind it, which we're seeing elsewhere in the gospel as well. This is a recurring theme. So when we reach the final verse, which is verse 27, it says, but those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me. This obviously alludes back to when we saw people not wanting to be under the rule of the king. And what we're looking at here is that this kingdom not only isn't inevitable, the kingdom is coming. Those who do not support it and who may not be responsible with what they have, who may try to tear it down, the king warns, you need to prepare. And each person must face this judgment. And this is a theme throughout this parable. We see people coming to face judgment for actions. So if you break this up into several parts, we also understand not only is the king returning, we can allude this with the destruction of Jerusalem. So all in all, what is this parable? Well, at the beginning, I think we can break it up into the idea that Jesus is going to return as king, and we have a responsibility in that. This is not like Matthew, like we stated earlier. We don't have different gifts portrayed here. Everyone has the same. And so while we all may be in different circumstances, there are some things that we all have. We all have time in the day. We all have the Bible. We all have the same opportunity to read the truth and to share it. We all have opportunities to serve God. And so while this is very similar to the parable of the talents, we're looking at a different situation, a different message here. We're not judged necessarily on the return either. We saw two servants with different returns, both have benefit. We're looking at how we manage what we are given. So that's where this title, Use It or Lose It, comes in. We are seeing these servants being told, you have a gift, you may use it, or, as we learn when one returns, if you do not use it, you can lose it. So in the later half of this parable, we see where this idea of use it or lose it comes from. We have an unfaithful servant who was fearful of his master, but I think it's important to note that the other two servants don't make any claims on an unfair master or a harsh master. And the fearful servant is saying, you reaped what you don't sow. And the other servants don't make this same claim. They did what they were told, and they were rewarded for it. So I think it's important to consider the statement of the third servant as potentially not true and a reflection instead of himself. We also see that these investments could be risky. This third servant notes that I was afraid to mess up, to not bring back to you what you expected, but the others risked as they were told, and therefore their faithful investment was returned. It's not necessarily about the amount, it's about the faithfulness that does provide return. Also, the third servant makes it clear that they were not forced to do anything. They were judged based on what they did, but they were not told exactly what to do and exactly where to go, and their hand was forced. And I think that alludes to modern Christians, that we have these opportunities and God blesses us with them, but we also have the freedom to make that decision. And because of that freedom, we also must face consequences for our decisions. So in a modern context, how can we look at this? It is incredibly important to note that even though we are not handed 3 months' wages and told what to do with it, this is very easy to allude to modern Christians. And it's, are we investing what God gives us properly? Be that time, talents. Are we investing our time in God every day? Are we obeying the truth that God gives us? And are we taking advantage of the opportunities that God offers to us on a regular basis? Not only do you give your return back to God, but you receive much more. And then, therefore, you can use those again and reap an even larger return. So it's really important to pay attention to the opportunities that we have to serve God and to use them in edifying and responsible ways that can point others to the kingdom and do these things that God is calling us to do. And so what I would call you to do this week is think about the opportunities that you have on a regular basis to serve God. Think about your daily opportunities, your weekly opportunities that occur in your everyday life, where you are and who you are with, who you can witness to, what others may notice, and think about how you can apply these lessons to your life. And what I want to leave you with is a few introspective questions that you can think about throughout your day and throughout your week as you remember this lesson and take the wisdom that God provides through His Word. Think about how the idea of a judgment seat makes you feel. Do you feel comfortable being there? Are there things that you're not proud of that will come up? And think about how you can move forward and do things that would make you feel more comfortable in that position. I also want you to think, what do you think God most desires to give to His followers? Are we serving a God who wants us to struggle, or are we serving a God who wants to see us succeed so that He can provide us more and so that He can give us more opportunities to spread His love and to spread His word? And I want you to think about, based on the passage we read today, how do you think we are called to live as we await Christ's return? Jesus is talking to people here who believe that this is about the end of the road, and He is telling them, no, I am leaving, and I have work for you to do while I'm gone, and then I will return, and then we will judge what happens then. And so I want you to think about that, and think about what do you think that calls us to do in a modern context.